back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. It is Lindsay and I back this week with the second part of the Buzzwords podcast series that we're doing. So if you've not listened to part one, you might want to consider stopping this, pausing it, go listen to that, and then come back to part two, or you could listen to it afterwards. So, you ready? Number one, processed food.
So what comes to mind with the processed food is that people, I don't know, it's a taboo thing, right? Like, oh, well, with all the processed foods and all the, processed foods, and no wonder with all the processed foods they eat. So it's just something that I think a lot of people critique or think there's something really wrong with it. And I guess what exactly is considered processed food?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll frame it in like what the technical terminology is, and then because the technical terminology is going to be different than what it is that I think that we'll all agree most people are worried about. From a technical standpoint, the entire category of processed food is anything that's been touched in any form. So you could buy blueberries at the grocery store that were washed prior to packaging and sent to you, and categorically it would be processed. We go and do grocery shopping at Albertsons, right? And sometimes you'll have corn that has been previously shucked and it's made to look like a perfectly square ear of corn, and that's considered processed. Or you'll have fajita vegetables that have been cut, so that can be considered processed. They say that those are minimally processed because they are. There's other processing, like if you buy a bag of frozen broccoli, for example, it's very likely been picked and frozen and packaged at the same facility before ever being shipped. It's processed, and many people might shy away from buying that because it's frozen and in a bag, and we've all been told don't eat things in bags in the freezer section of the grocery store. But in reality, that's often has more nutrition in it and is fresher than what you're buying from the fresh produce section at the grocery store, because you don't have time on a truck, you don't have transit, you don't have time on a shelf, you don't have all of those things. It's packaged at peak freshness. But I don't really think that that's what people care about when they hear the word processed food. Processed foods are... So the foods that we've talked about to this point are very minimally processed stuff. Ultra processed food is the term that's given to what I think most people are concerned about, which would be breads or sweets or chips or frozen French fries and frozen fish sticks, things of that nature. And those foods have generally they've not just been altered in terms of like cut, they've had something added to them. So we'll use like frozen fish sticks, for example. Not only have they filleted the fish, they've battered the fish, they've par-fried the fish, which means they've started the frying process. So all you have to do as the consumer is put it in the microwave. So they're adding ingredients to make sure that that stays fresh in the freezer section. And, it adds a component of convenience to your life. But you're not buying fish. You're buying fish, breading, oil, extra fat, extra carbohydrate, all these extra things that you wouldn't find in typical fish. So I think when it comes to processed food, that's what most people are probably concerned about. The question is like, is it bad or does it matter? Or I guess I should ask you, what do you have heard about it, or what people have mentioned about it?
Kind of just what I said. They say, oh, what is it? Shop the perimeter of the store to avoid processed foods. I think they think processed and packaged is always the same thing, like in a cardboard box, bags of chips.
Yeah. And I think that like this podcast might be a lot shorter than the other one, because all 5 categories we're talking about, I think, are going to fall under this whole category of like the American diet, like the common American diet right now. Processed foods And like the theme I think that's going to carry through all of these is the thing that we say all of the time, which is the dose. It's the dose that makes the poison. So the ultra processed foods are without question, when you look at the standard American diet, what is contributing to a large majority of chronic disease. Not because those ultra processed foods in and of themselves are bad. It's because we tend to overconsume them, largely because they taste so good. They're so easily accessible, and there is such a minimal barrier from purchase to plate to where it's like you don't have to cook it. You're willing to just pull something out of the freezer, press the one on the microwave, and before you know it, you've got 10 fish sticks that you may not even really be hungry for. So in that sense, ultra processed food definitely can contribute to higher calorie intakes, which, as we've seen across the board, contributes to a vast majority of the obesity epidemic. Now, it's easy to feel siloed, like we live in the West. Very rarely, I would say, do we think about anything in the East, in New York and Massachusetts, Vermont, and all this. But we study like the US. When we study obesity epidemics, we study the US. You have people who live in inner cities and who are primarily buying their groceries from small grocery stores called bodegas and things of that nature. Those type of stores generally have a lot of ultra processed foods, and a lot of these folks, those are sometimes less expensive. A lot of those folks are making their dollar stretch, and they're buying those things. I mean, it's not to say like that's the only reason they're buying them. They're buying because they taste good, but it's to say that when we study the US nutrition habits and the obesity epidemic, there is like a very stark contrast in sugar, fat, and salt intake in the US in the last 20, 30 years. And a lot of that is because of these ultra processed foods. But is a single fish stick going to kill you? No. Is a single potato chip, or even a single donut, or a single cookie, or even a single can of Coke? No. But very few to very rarely is someone just eating a single fish stick, right? I mean, that's generally a part of a lunch. That is a part of a total daily calorie intake where most of these foods make that up. I'd even go out on a limb to say this too. These aren't just like cheap generic fish sticks. This is true of your organic matte boxed Trader Joe fish stick too. I mean, the same things that are causing the problems with our health are not just related to, quote unquote additives from these cheap companies. It's overall how it's packaged, how it's prepared, the fact that there's added fats, oils, etc. before you ever buy it. Doesn't matter if it comes from the store, at Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, or somewhere else. It's the nutrition profile of that product and the amount of it that we eat that is causing the biggest driver of the obesity epidemic. Next up, second topic is, oh boy, seed oils.
I did not even know this was a big deal. We had a friend reach out actually on this one and bring it up because she was very concerned that seed oils were concerning. Didn't know why, had heard something, sent us some posts from people that didn't have a background in nutrition. Last night early 4th of July, I made that cake and didn't have vegetable oil. So I used olive oil. I mentioned the olive oil thing and they said, oh, that's okay because, rumor has it that seed oil isn't great for you. So it's good that you made it with this. I don't even know what constitutes a seed oil. What is a misconception? Where is that coming from? Because clearly enough people heard something or are twisting something, maybe based loosely on something true.
Yeah. So I think before I even go here, I am going to make this very basic. I don't want to go a million different directions and into tangents because that is all that there is out there about it. And I feel like it's only confused. And when you ask people, like last podcast, we talked about how do you know who to trust? And my advice was just ask questions. And if that ends up leading to an endpoint where that person can't tell you why they believe what they believe, then take that for what it's worth. And when you ask questions about people about this, like last night, and you were to say, really, well, what's so bad about a seed oil? The comment is often, I don't know. They just say it's bad. And they is typically someone on social media. Now, when you go into these posts and you go into kind of where this origin was, which was like Paul Saladino and some of these other guys that have become sort of infamous for this, you find that they're really looking at or talking about or blaming seed oils for being problematic in three ways: inflammation, heart disease, and metabolic health, which would be like diagnosis of diabetes, etc. All right. And so you have to look at it and say, okay, is that true? Are seed oils causing any issues in those three areas?
Just to clarify, what is an example of a seed oil, or some examples that are commonly used?
Yep. So that's a good preface. So seed oils are, as you might imagine, oils that come from plants, right? So we could basically put it like that. There are a ton of different types that range from things you're probably familiar with, like a sunflower seed. There's sunflower oil. There's canola oil. There's olive oil. There's all of these liquid plant-based oils. And this isn't universally true, but to keep this simple, by and large, what you're hearing is that any plant-based seed oil is causing all of these issues.
But when I made the cake with olive oil, she said people are starting to do that because they're avoiding seed oils. Is that a misunderstanding?
It probably was. So this is where it starts to get technical. These different seed oils have different nutrition profiles, and they are made up of different types of fat. So you have fat as a whole, then you have subcategories of good fats and bad fats: monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, saturated, trans fat, which is something a lot of people have heard. So you have all these subcategories. Each of these seed oils are made up of different percentages of the good, bad, neutral types of fats. And so when you look at those profiles, you'll see olive oil isn't as much of a stepchild as the others. So people will often say like, yeah, well, buy the blah, blah, blah version of it, you might be okay. But when you look at seed oils as a whole and you look at those three topics, again, they were inflammation, heart disease, and metabolic health is generally what people are saying about them. Like here's what we tend to find in big groups. We tend to find, number one, inflammation. When you replace a diet that is high in saturated fat, and saturated fat's generally found in animal products, butter, coconut oil, all these different types of oils, or different types of fats. When you replace those fats with unsaturated fatty acids, even from seed oils, inflammatory markers go down. Now, one of your questions in here is like, what is inflammation? Inflammation, there's a difference between acute inflammation, which if you cut your finger and you look at it the next day and it's really red and puffy and swollen, that's acute, versus chronic inflammation, which is kind of like this white noise inflammation going on in the background all the time because of lifestyle choices. Some of that's like smoking, right? That's going to always bring on, if someone's a smoker, they're going to have a chronic inflammatory state. But what we're learning is that obesity causes that type of background white noise too. But what these people are saying is any plant oils causes an inflammatory response, right? When you look at, is that true? We don't find that. In fact, we find either neutral effect, meaning there is no effect, or we find an improved effect when someone substitutes these type of oils for saturated fats. We find the same thing with heart disease. We find the same thing with metabolic health. In fact, one of the blood markers that shows inflammation goes down when you replace some saturated fat in a diet, high saturated fat diets, with these unsaturated fatty acids, which include plant oils, right? So all of these things come down. Now, naturally, someone's going to say, like, well, then where are these influencers pulling this information from? I've watched an Instagram reel and they show the study, they show the paper on the screen. So, like, these things exist. That is true. There are studies that exist that show an increased consumption of seed oils will drive some of these markers. What they don't show you is how these are delivered. And this goes back to point one. When you're buying baked products and frozen goods and fish sticks and oven French, when you're buying all of these ultra processed foods, they are fried in seed oil. When you go to your local fast food restaurant and you buy a burger and fries, they are fried in seed oil. So again, it's the dose that makes the poison. If you take a teaspoon of oil and you drizzle it over your Brussels sprouts and roast it in the oven, that is not driving inflammation, heart disease, and metabolic health. When your breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks consist of ultra-processed foods that have been fried in seed oils, that is the problem. It's the dose that causes the issue. It's not the fact that someone's actually consuming it. So rather than this mantra of seed oils are killing us, we should be instead saying it would be wise to reduce how much ultra-processed foods you eat, because that would take care of all of it, right? And that's what's challenging about all of these nutrition topics is they are siloing. It's seeing the forest from the trees, right? They're talking about a single tree being the problem, whenever in reality, like, we need to look at the forest, and that would fix pretty much all of these issues, because none of these in and of themselves are bad. It's like we always say, it's the dose that makes the poison. All right. We may have already answered some of these for you, but inflammation, what have you heard? Oh, saturated fat, what have you heard?
This is one that I think isn't talked about a lot. I feel like for the most part, when people at least speak to me about these things, it's fat is either good or bad. And it's not in moderation. It's like good, or they'll say good fats, like eat avocados and peanut butter. And then they'll just reference everything else as bad fat. I don't think there's a lot of awareness. But I remember when we first, maybe weren't even married or just married, and my numbers for my annual whatever came back high in high cholesterol and A1C too. So I had these unhealthy numbers concerning numbers for my blood draw. And I said, oh, well, why do they highlight this? And you were saying, well, this is what this one means. And this is what this one means. And I said, well, saturated fat, because I had asked you, well, what can I do to bring these down? And he said, well, one step could be less saturated fat. And so I asked you what saturated fat was. And at one point had said, if you could rule out, as a dietitian, when I was learning what a dietitian does, I said, if you could remove one food from the face of the earth to make everybody healthy, what would it be? And you didn't name just a food. You said, I would take out saturated fat if I had to choose one. So me not knowing anything about this, I said, well, what's saturated fat in? And you got quiet and smirked. And I said, is it in something I eat? And your eyes got wide. And I said, something I eat a lot. And you just nodded. So turns out eating just eating off of a block of cheese for meals is not best. I didn't coat things in a lot of butter, but I had also heard Greek yogurt was healthy, like healthier than regular yogurt. So I was like, oh, Greek yogurt, great. And there's this really good honey Greek yogurt. So I would eat like a few cups in a sitting, and like granola and fruit. I'm like, oh, everyone's going to think I'm so healthy. So
what happened? Because you were pretty on it. When we had that conversation, you really made some changes in what you were eating. What happened over time to your lab values?
There was two concerns that I mentioned. One was the cholesterol, and then one was the high A1C. So one of them was eating, I think this is tied to the A1C, correct me if I'm wrong, eating less carbs, like stockpiling carbs in a meal. So I would eat an entire plate or just a full box of macaroni and cheese, or a mini pizza, or want a smaller pizza all to myself. And you said, those aren't bad foods, but consider, and I asked for help, by the way, had to ask like a lot for help from you because you wouldn't just give it to me because you didn't want to be bossy, I think. But anyway, I would just have less. I would still have carbs at every meal, but less of them. So they'd make up less of my entire plate. I'm picturing that illustration of the plate in the different sections. So I had less carbs at a meal. Oh, my A1C went down to like a normal range. I was like a few steps away from pre-diabetic, and the concern went away. With the cholesterol, it went down as well. It was like the full fat yogurt and full fat things in general. I really liked like fancy coffee drinks. I liked, like really fatty meat for a snack. Like kielbasa. I like to make eggs and kielbasa at least once a week for a meal. Regular butter, I didn't do a lot of that. And then I liked milkshakes a lot. And so what was helpful for me, because I didn't want to count calories, I didn't want to measure a lot, was just to set rules. I said, what's a realistic amount of times a week I should go get a milkshake if I want to make these numbers healthier?
Yeah, and we set them to like, I think it was once a week if I remember right, and then reducing the portion size when you went. But the story matters because it's indicative of why saturated fat is worth covering. Saturated fat has like had this metamorphosis where it went from being the known thing that drives heart disease among all research to now being like promoted as what you should be eating. And I'll say this too, although the block of cheese on the counter being solid at room temperature is a simplified way to describe what a saturated fat is from a chemistry standpoint, one of the main issues with it is we know that if there's injury in an artery wall, which we all get over time for various reasons, plaque tends to accumulate around that injury in the artery wall. And we know from a chemistry standpoint, saturated fats tend to collect there more than others. And we know through many years of research, and I know that that's a callous term, like people have said, when you say research, you lose me. Not in the sense of it gets complicated, but I don't trust research. And my reply to that is like, well, what are you going to trust then? Because you're throwing a lot of chance out there. And I would say also, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because you're basically saying we have all these years of data saying X causes Y or X does not cause Y. It really can help inform what to do if you're trying to be healthy. And then second, like your perfect example, whenever we see someone make those dietary changes, those labs improve, which we know improves heart disease. And there are different risk calculations where you can determine and you can estimate what's the likelihood this person, based on diet and lifestyle, is going to have a heart attack in the next X number of years. You can predict that based on these factors from these studies. So again, like if you have a tablespoon of real butter on your sourdough, are you going to soon be in the cardiac ward trying to get a stent put in your heart? No, you're not. If you are eating boxes of mac and cheese, blocks of pepper jack cheese, cases of salami, and drinking milkshakes because you heard someone online say saturated fat is good, is that looking optimal for your heart attack risk? No, it's not. So like everything, again, the dose is what makes the poison. And while I would probably answer different now had you asked like what's one thing you would get rid of if you could, and largely because I think I've just become more educated and see things like more full circle and recognize like, well, it is the dose that makes the poison. So I don't know that I would entirely get rid of it. I mean, we eat cheese still, even with that. So yeah, I think the saturated fat is important to loop in here when you're talking about seed oils, because it compares and contrasts two different types of fats that are both known for driving health, but it also goes to show that like even a type of fat that has been shown to improve some cardiovascular disease can be bad when in excess, and can be what we know as energy toxicity, which is just excess calorie intake And the one thing that I think everyone can agree on, no matter what camp they sit in, no matter what influencer they are, is that there is a universal trend we're seeing now where I'll take myself as an example. If I still weighed 270 pounds and I had that really high risk marker, I was obese, like the class 3, it's across the board. We are seeing there's a chronic state of inflammation, and those are tied to every kind of metabolic disease that we know of. And the best thing that one person can do on the face of the planet, if they are there, the best thing that I could have done wasn't to stop eating plant oils. It wasn't to stop eating saturated fat. It wasn't to even stop eating fish sticks. It was to lose weight. Doesn't matter how I do it. Doesn't matter how I go about it. If I can find a method that I can be consistent with, the absolute best thing that's going to keep me alive is losing some of that 275 pounds, 70 pounds. So again, with all of these, none of it in and of itself is bad. It's always the dose that makes the poison, and it's the sum of the parts that matters the most.
This is one that when I think about something inflamed, like I think about, I guess, you have a sore tooth and your gums are swollen, or you have a cut, or even like an ingrown toenail and it swells up and it's red and it doesn't feel good. Like when I think of inflammation, that is what I thought of. So when I started hearing this more, and for me, I have only ever heard it from women, which naturally that's who I'm talking to more, but it's usually dairy. I went off of dairy because it caused inflammation. I went off of gluten because it caused inflammation. Or they'll say, my doctor couldn't figure out why I was having, they will say, stomach issues or issues with whatever. And I don't remember some of the other ones, but stomach issues was a big one. And they go, oh, it's because you're eating a lot of inflammatory foods. So I've heard it tied more to dairy, gluten, I get maybe sugar. I'm trying to think. And yeah, I don't know what those foods are, but that they're cutting out, but supposedly there are certain foods that are considered inflammatory. So I don't know what those foods are or why they would cause inflammation. And with that, what is being inflamed in their body?
Candidly, if the doctor said that, they're taking a stab in the dark, unless they have blood work. And what that means typically, and I only know this because I've worked in these facilities, is we're running out of options here. Let's try it, right? Because, from a Western medicine standpoint, there's really nothing else that we can see that's wrong. Maybe it's something you're eating. Now, you can do tests, right? You can do tests and see if something's causing you an issue. I'll give you an example in a minute, but I think here's the important thing to think about when you're talking about all of the foods you just mentioned. If you think of food allergies, right? Anyone could be allergic to anything. It could be anything, right? I mean, you name any type of, someone could be allergic to cinnamon, someone else a walnut, someone else a blueberry. It could be anything. But we know that there are a collection of about 5 or so food allergies that tend to pop up most often. Nuts, shellfish, all of these different foods, right? The dairy, sugar, and gluten one tend to be the ones that come up the most often with people who have intolerances towards food. So they're going to be the 3 that if anyone is winging it, you get suggested that you should eliminate first. Now, without a test, we don't know, but those are the ones that tend to come up the most often. So they'll say, eliminate those. What we don't see, though, again, is that if someone does not have a problem with them, that those foods as a whole for the entire population are causing inflammation. So I'll use myself for example. I don't have any issues with gluten. I don't have any issues with dairy. I don't have any issues with sugar. But the assumption is that, as those are all inflammatory foods, so if you were to eat them, there's inflammation in you too. And that's not true. You cannot isolate any single food and apply it broadly to the whole population. You can't do that with seed oils. You can't do that with saturated fat. You can't do that with processed food. And you can't do that with wheat, gluten, or you can't do that with wheat. You can't do that with gluten. You can't do that with sugar. And you can't do that with dairy. So I think that's first and foremost the most important thing to remember. The second thing that you've got to ask yourself sometimes is, well, the doctor said that I should go off of gluten. Now, it's not just that you've gotten rid of gluten, you are now also no longer eating, a muffin and a Starbucks latte at breakfast. And like your diet changes overall. And generally what happens is people stop eating ultra processed foods and they start eating more nutrient dense whole foods. Oh my gosh, I feel so much better. But if we don't have a blood marker, can we blame it on the gluten or can we blame it on the change? And that's a true question. I don't know. And does it even matter? You feel better? Who cares? It doesn't really matter. It's not really a game of who's right or who's wrong. But what we cannot say is we cannot say gluten, dairy, and sugar are all inflammatory. In and of themselves, whenever it's isocaloric, meaning we're accounting for the calories, and we were able to look at one food and say, this food is this, we cannot say that about those three foods. So I think that's important to remember. The second kind of question you asked was, what is being inflamed? Well, I think that it could be, you could isolate it to one area, the stomach or the intestines or the large intestines or the small intestines or any of those things. But when you're hearing about it on social media, it's usually that chronic white noise behind the scenes overall inflammation at a cellular level, which again, it's hard to imagine that. It's hard to picture that. It's hard to create like a vision around what that looks like because we can't really see cells. We've all seen a picture of a stomach in its cartoonish form, so it's easier for us to imagine, but you can't see it at like a cellular level. But usually when they're saying like it causes inflammation, most people are meaning at a overall cellular level, you're walking around in a quote unquote state of inflammation.
When people describe what they feel like when you've had patients or clients now that say, oh, I had this inflammation, what are they describing? Because I picture, at times that I eat out a lot and there's a lot of like salty food, I feel puffy. Like, is that what people mean with inflammation? Or when I eat a lot of rich, like cream-based soups or pasta with rich sauce, I've got a stomach ache, like for a day or so. Like I don't feel well. I'm not allergic to gluten. It's probably all just this like, right, fat and oil in the food. But is that like when people say inflammation, chances are, what are the symptoms that they experience? Because they can't see a cellular level. So what are they?
What people will say is they'll feel less puffy. They'll feel less swollen, which makes them feel less weighty. And not like, oh, I've lost weight. You just don't walk around with that state of feeling. Like if you go outside and you work in the sun for, in the morning, like you're working in the garden and it's hot outside and you're drinking water, but maybe not that much. And you come inside and like your wedding band feels like it's just erupting from your finger because your finger's gotten so swollen. They stop feeling like that, or their joints begin to improve, or it's hard to say because everyone's going to experience something different from doing that. And I would say this, even if you don't have blood markers, and even if we don't have anything that says, oh yes, this food siloed in and of itself is inflammatory, if we have nothing that says that, but you feel better not eating something, then it doesn't really matter. I wouldn't eat it. But the biggest thing is that like what's going on now is people are like demonizing foods it's not true. And so you have people who tolerate all of these things fine, who stop eating them and are now wondering what to eat. And the question's always like, well, were you having any issues with those? No, I felt fine. well, then you're probably fine to eat them. It's a tough topic to cover because everyone's experience is going to be different, and you have to kind of know the personal experience to be able to really speak to the specifics. But I think, again, the bigger overall theme with this is what we're seeing across the board, which is the dose that makes the poison. And you can't silo whole food groups and apply it to the entire population and say, this is bad. You can do that with some foods. I'll get like nitrates, for example. We see across the board in population, ultra processed meats, whenever they're processed with nitrates, etc., drives up risk of colon cancer. That's universal. That's got nothing to do with any one person. It's not untrue for someone. It's true for everyone. So like you can do that in some scenarios, but with what we're talking about here, we haven't, at least not yet anyway, seen that. All right, antioxidant.
That's one that I just feel like I've heard, rich in antioxidants, and you want this because it's rich in antioxidants. So it's something that's promoted. It's something that's seen as beneficial, I think. But are they occurring naturally? Is it something that you add into food? What are they? What's the benefit?
Antioxidants in foods, and what do they do for human health? In a nutshell, and this is a good conversation to loop in with the inflammation piece of it, you are producing one of the things that we know causes chronic disease, specifically, like very true of cancer, is the development of free radicals, right? And we won't get into a big definition about what that is, but let's just say that they're harmful compounds that we create, which, by the way, like sometimes you do good things and create these. For example, exercise creates a state of inflammation and can sometimes produce free radicals. But when you eat a diet rich in antioxidants basically are, I view them, like I picture them in my head as missiles for free radicals. So when you have an antioxidant, it will neutralize, I'm using very basic terminology here, so please don't email me unless you want to, you can, but don't email me yelling at me. You basically neutralize the risk of that free radical, right? Thereby, if you think about every one missile neutralizing every one risk, the net effect is health. If you outweigh your free radicals with your neutralizing missiles, that's going to be unhealth. Does that make sense? Okay. So when you eat a diet, which is where you get antioxidants from, when you eat a diet high in antioxidants, you naturally have more missiles to combat these free radicals with, which we can sort of, in a generalized sense, assume means you're going to have a much lower health risk of these specific chronic diseases. Well, where are antioxidant-rich foods found? Fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. So again, like this goes back to the whole carnivore red meat podcast we did a few episodes ago, where it's like we again can't look at these foods and say these are killing us. They are literally saving us. So, I don't know if that answers the questions or if you have others, but
where did the free radicals come from? You might have said it, but I might have missed it.
A lot of different places, right? Like, so even exercise can create free radicals. Pollution breathed in the air. If you're a smoker, a chronic state of obesity. I hate using that word. I just feel like it's so clinical and calloused, and it could be any variety of different things, most of which we've got control over in our behavioral and our daily choices, and some of which we don't. So, it's not like you can choose. Well, you can choose your way away from free radicals, but not entirely. So these are still important. If you guys have any questions about anything you've heard here, please don't hesitate to email. I know there's a lot covered here. It's always hard to be thorough, but simple, but also succinct. If you have any questions, feel free to email us. We appreciate you joining us, and you guys had a great 4th. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks. Have a good week, everyone.